Our guest today is John Chisholm. John's a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, now based in San Francisco and involved in a number of ventures. And he was here today talking in the business and economic ethics class about entrepreneurship and more specifically about how to think like an entrepreneur. A lot of fascinating material there. One of the first things you mentioned was motivational, about why people might consider entrepreneurship as their option as opposed to working for an existing organization. What are the motivating values here?
Well, I can suggest three reasons. One is the freedom to do what you love. Two is security for you and your family. And one thing I remind students is that no one is going to provide for their security except for them, and not to rely on the government, because who knows what could happen there.
Particularly young people who are looking 40 years down the road at retirement.
Yeah.
Yes.
And especially today that we have a government shutdown, that might seem particularly relevant.
That's coincidental, yes.
And third is opportunities that are unique to each and every one of us. Everyone has a unique set of skills, knowledge, relationships, reputation, and these give each of us the ability to do something or to start a business that potentially nobody else can. And so developing that and taking advantage of that opportunity is one of the drivers of entrepreneurship.
When people get into entrepreneurship, when they think about it as a career, there's two things that we hear a lot. One is the positive motivation about passion, finding something that you're interested in, excited about rather, and trying to pursue a career there. But we also hear that entrepreneurship is very hard work. It can be grueling, sometimes overwhelming, and so forth. And so perseverance, right, is important. And both passion and perseverance were central to your talk, but an interplay between the two was interesting. How does that work?
Yes. I see them as feeding on each other. They don't necessarily go together. You can have one without the other. For example, if you can have passion without perseverance, and that is not likely to lead anywhere long term. I call it a passing fancy.
Sure.
Or you can have perseverance without passion, but that's drudgery, and it isn't likely to be very sustainable. But the combination of the two is very powerful, and they feed on each other. I call that combination flow. Some people call it flourishing. It goes by different names. But examples of passion driving perseverance are when you are so deeply engaged by an activity or a subject that you spend so much time with that the hours go by like minutes.
Right.
And there, your passion is driving perseverance. It's making perseverance easy. An alternative example is perseverance driving passion. There, you could, if you just dedicate yourself to working on or learning about a particular activity so that you start to get good at it and feel good doing it, then that's an example of perseverance making you or helping you become passionate about something.
Right. In many cases, you find out that you're passionate about something that you wouldn't have become passionate about had you not persevered.
Exactly.
Past a certain threshold and so on.
Yeah.
All right, good. Now, a lot of your talk, particularly the middle part of your talk, focused on personal psychology. In many cases, people can have self-defeating psychological habits, but then also self-empowering, right, psychological habits. So one of the things, for example, you mentioned was being careful about negative thoughts, for example, and how do you deal with negative thoughts? So of course, we're all going to have negative thoughts, but what's their place in the process?
Well, one of the things I say is never say anything negative about yourself. And if you have to, use the past tense.
Okay.
That's the way I used to be. But it's not the way I am now, or it's not the way I am going forward, or it's not the direction I'm going in. I emphasize that the brain is like, the human brain is like an iceberg, with only 20% of it consciously aware of the messages that come in, and 80% of it unconscious. And that unconscious mind is doing a lot of processing of messages, And some of those messages that we repeat to ourselves again and again, it accepts as truth. And so a negative idea can turn into reality. So we don't want to repeat negative thoughts about ourselves. That'll hold us back. So I suggest that for any negative thought that might creep into your mind, think of a specific incident, no matter how small, where you did the opposite. If it was at a party, you put everybody else at ease. If it was in a game, you were the star. And keep that specific incident in the forefold of your mind. Think about it, maybe write it down, maybe describe it in detail, maybe tell others about it, and then let that push the negative thoughts out of your mind.
How does that work with kind of an honest self-evaluation where sometimes it is appropriate to recognize that you do have deficiencies, weaknesses, you've made mistakes, and you do have to confront those in order to learn from them? So we don't want to go down the road of denying that one has weaknesses or that one has engaged in inappropriate behaviors or whatever. So how do you balance what you were just saying with honest self-evaluation, including evaluation of weaknesses that you have?
Well, as I said, it's okay in the past tense. This is what I've done before. This is the way. This was my performance before, and maybe you can identify some improvement to that performance even since it happened. If so, great. That's progress already starting. And then you can talk about this is the direction I'm going in and this is what I plan to do in the future.
Two more social points. Entrepreneurs often are leaders, and so they set the tone right, so to speak. And so cultivating the right kind of social, psychological atmosphere in a startup firm is also important. And there you're also emphasizing the positive. Can you give us some examples of what you mean by that?
Well, one of the things I say about culture is that it emerges, it's emergent. It's not directly controlled by anyone, even the CEO, although the CEO certainly has more influence over it than any other person, because others will look to his or her example and follow that. But it is a combination of the interactions of everybody in the company. And I think two things that are particularly important is in driving culture is how decisions are made and how people treat each other. And again, for both of these, the CEO can play a very central role, including others in the decisions, delegating decisions, trusting others to make the right decision, and treating each other or the others respectfully in the same way that he or she would like to be treated. Right.
So including criticism. The criticism is constructive criticism, not blame storming and all of that usual stuff that we hear about.
Something I often say is look for and find the good in the people around you. This is something I look for in other executives and try to work on in myself. And build on that good, no matter how small. So just as it's helpful to me to build on the small good things I've done, so is it really good for others to have you and others recognize the good things they've done, acknowledge them, and build on them.
So then an important part of the entrepreneur's function is going to be selecting people who are in the team, and their psychology and their attitudes that they bring to it are also going to be adding to the mix. So you're going to have people who have technical skill sets, but they might not be the right social mix if they don't have that same ability to contribute positively, positive feedback loops and so forth.
So there's a lot there. On the one hand, you want to find people who have a positive mindset and who will can-do attitude and who will contribute to those cultural elements that we talk about, that we've just talked about. And at the same time, you don't want to get everybody identical in the company, because if everybody is identical, then somebody isn't necessary. And there are lots of ways to think about diversity. The way that seems to be most valuable to any team, as far as I can tell, is cognitive diversity. Any business team. So how do different members of the team think about things? Do they all, well, what are some of the ways people can be different? Some people focus on the big picture. Some people focus on the individual components. Some people are more relationship and dealing with other people. Some people are more transactional. And having a mix of those different styles, I think, strengthens the team. In fact, Scott Page at the University of Michigan has done tests that find that teams that are diverse in cognitively outperform teams that are stronger but less diverse, more homogeneous cognitively.
Is there a double-edged sword to the cognitive diversity? Because then you have cognitive styles and they can clash, right, as well as being complementary to each other. So as part of an additional level of management is being able to manage the clash constructively?
Yes, and I do think you can go too far and that there's an optimal middle ground.
Okay.
I think of them as three overlapping circles, say like a Venn diagram. If they're two all overlapping, that's suboptimal. But if they're completely non-overlapping, the members of that team may have trouble working together.
Okay, fair enough. Issues of money and funding obviously come up a lot in entrepreneurship, right, at all levels. But particularly the entry stage, young people are often deterred because they don't think they can raise the funding, or they don't know how to think about the funding process. And you did have some advice about seeking funding, but not until you're ready. All right, so what does that mean? When are you ready to seek funding?
Well, I do think there are a finite number of times in a company's life that are optimal for fundraising. And they are right after the company has achieved a significant milestone that reduces risk to potential investors.
Okay.
And when would those times be?
Okay.
Well, typically, here's some examples. If you are profitable, that eliminates the risk that you can generate revenue. If you can generate revenue, that eliminates the risk that you can get customers. If you have customers, that eliminates the risk that your prototype works. And if you have a working prototype, that eliminates the risk that your idea can even be made to work in the first place.
Okay.
So those are examples of milestones that would probably be perceived as significant risk reducers by prospective investors. Of course, a key question is, how can an entrepreneur get to that point where they have reached one of those milestones? That's going to perhaps take some funding just to get there.
Right.
And so I encourage them to look at all of their resources. And so we fill out that chart that has lots of different types of assets on it. You may have a spare bedroom. Great. That means that I don't have to rent an office. I may have some computer equipment and access to the internet. Great. That means I don't have to buy that equipment. Whatever, friends and family can provide initial funding. I can be creative about how I engage others to get involved with the company. I can perhaps offer a combination of stock and flexibility in addition to capital, and that way get additional
Right, or
skills.
getting people who are enthusiastic about the product, right, or the project, right? And so the compensations necessarily will be lower, but they'll get more psychological rewards. That sort of
yeah.
Okay, so being creative in all those dimensions.
Absolutely.
Right. Toward the end, you also talked about ethics, which certainly as an ethics professor I found refreshing. And you raised the provocative question about whether entrepreneurship is ethical, particularly since in business ethics we don't hear a lot about entrepreneurship. So what were your thoughts there?
Well, I do think it is one of the most ethical career choices you can make, and let me explain why I say that. First of all, as you said, we don't often hear about entrepreneurship. What do we hear about? We hear about corporate philanthropy as being very ethical. We hear about graft and corruption and theft as being unethical. And I don't disagree with either of those, but I don't think it's the whole story, and I don't even think it's the most important part of the story. And I think to see the full story, it's helpful to look at the stages of the entrepreneurial process. Okay. What does it require for somebody to become an entrepreneur? Well, they have to have an idea, which they have to develop. That takes rationality, creativity, persistence. They have to have the courage to strike out on their own. That takes courage. They have to have intellectual honesty to reject an idea for which there's no customer demand, as I eventually was forced to do with my first company when I, after 6 months, finally accepted the fact there was no customer demand for a cool new technology called conditional voting. And you have to create win-wins with your employees, with your customers, or else they're not going to deal with you. They're going to go somewhere else. So all of these qualities in an individual that entrepreneurship demands are qualities I think it's fair to say we'd like to see in the people around us, and our neighbors and our coworkers. Now consider the social benefits that entrepreneurship generates. Well, it's impossible to be successful as an entrepreneur without making the world a better place by creating more choice, more innovation, lower costs, or some combination of the above. Because again, if people don't feel their world is going to be made better by your product or service, they don't have to buy it. They're going to go elsewhere. Similarly, all of your stakeholders, the employees, shareholders, and customers and partners, their worlds have to be made better, or else they're going to go elsewhere. So both individually and socially, I see lots of qualities that we like in our coworkers and neighbors that entrepreneurship brings out in the people around us, and which entrepreneurship demands if you're going to be successful at it. And if you stand back and look at the tens of millions of entrepreneurs around the world who are all serving customer needs and creating these win-wins and innovating, they are driving improvements in quality of life, standard of living, and economic growth around the world.
And all that is deeply ethical, absolutely.
And incidentally, guess what's funding most of the philanthropy in the world? That's entrepreneurship. So given all of those factors, I rest my case that entrepreneurship is among the most ethical career choices you can make.
So as an individual, entrepreneurship requires certain virtues of character. For the venture to succeed, there has to be a network of win-win relationships that are developed. Those make the world a better place in a number of respects, including philanthropy, because of all of the extra wealth that it generates. All right. Fascinating. All right. Well, thanks very much for being with us today. I'm sure the students found it very eye-opening.
It's been very fun. Stephen, thank you.
John.